The unseen follower. It was a cool autumn evening when Emily decided to take her usual walk through the park. The air was crisp, the leaves crunching under her feet as she strolled along the familiar path. The park was quiet, only the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves breaking the silence. She enjoyed the solitude, the way the world seemed to slow down in the twilight hours. As she rounded a bend, she noticed something odd. The shadows seemed to be shifting unnaturally, almost as if they had a life of their own. She shook her head, dismissing it as a trick of the fading light. But as she continued walking, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her pace quickened, the sense of unease growing with each step. Suddenly, she heard it, a faint shuffling behind her. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She slowly turned around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty path stretching behind her, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. She let out a shaky breath and continued on, telling herself she was just being paranoid. But the sound returned, louder this time, like footsteps echoing her own. Emily broke into a run, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she fled down the path. She could hear it now, the unmistakable sound of someone, or something, chasing her. She didn't dare look back, too terrified to see what might be lurking in the shadows. As she neared the park's exit, the footsteps suddenly stopped. Emily stumbled to a halt, glancing around frantically. The park was deathly silent. Not even the wind dared to blow. She could feel a presence, something malevolent, watching her from the darkness. Her eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A figure, barely visible in the dim light, standing beneath a tree. It was tall, its body shrouded in shadow, with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her body refused to move, paralyzed by fear. The figure drew closer, its eyes locking onto hers. Emily could feel the air around her grow colder, the temperature plummeting as the figure reached out a hand. It was then that she saw it, long, spindly fingers, too long to be human, with nails that glinted like polished steel. She snapped out of her trance, her survival instincts kicking in. Emily turned and sprinted toward the exit, her legs burning with the effort. She could hear the creature behind her, its breath hot on her neck. Just as she reached the gate, she felt something graze her back, a cold, sharp sensation that sent chills down her spine. Emily burst through the gate and onto the street, her heart racing as she glanced over her shoulder. The park was empty, the figure nowhere to be seen. She collapsed onto the sidewalk, gasping for breath, her mind racing to comprehend what had just happened. In the days that followed, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. She'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eye, hear footsteps echoing hers, and feel that same cold chill whenever she was alone. She started avoiding the park, taking different routes home, but the feeling never left her. One night, as she lay in bed, she heard it again, that familiar shuffling sound. She sat up, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. She strained to listen, but the sound had stopped. Then, slowly, the door to her bedroom creaked open. The locked ward. Jessica had always been fascinated by the old psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of town. The building had been abandoned for decades, its once grand facade now crumbling and overgrown with ivy. Local legends told of the horrors that had occurred within its walls. Experiments gone wrong, patients driven mad by their own delusions, and the spirits of those who had never left. One crisp autumn afternoon, Jessica decided to explore the hospital herself. Armed with a flashlight and a camera, she made her way through the rusted gates and onto the overgrown grounds. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the silence oppressive. As she approached the entrance, she felt a chill run down her spine, but she shook it off, determined to document her adventure. The inside of the hospital was even more unsettling than she had imagined. The halls were lined with decaying wallpaper, the floors covered in dust and debris. Every door she passed seemed to groan in protest as she pushed it open, revealing rooms filled with broken furniture and medical equipment left to rot. The air was thick with a sense of unease, as if the building itself was alive, watching her every move. As Jessica ventured deeper into the hospital, she came across a set of heavy metal doors marked Ward C. The door was locked, but with a bit of effort, she managed to pry it open. The air inside was cold, the darkness impenetrable. She hesitated for a moment before stepping through, the door slamming shut behind her with a deafening clang. The ward was a labyrinth of narrow hallways and small, claustrophobic rooms. The walls were covered in strange symbols, scrawled in what looked like dried blood. Jessica's heart raced as she moved through the space, her flashlight flickering ominously. She could hear faint whispers, just on the edge of her perception, but every time she tried to focus on them, they vanished. She reached the end of the hallway, where a single door stood slightly ajar. As she pushed it open, the smell hit her, an overwhelming stench of rot and decay. Inside, she found what remained of a patient's room. The bed was overturned, the walls scratched and clawed at, as if someone had tried desperately to escape. But what caught her attention was the figure in the corner. A man, or what was left of him, sat hunched over, his back to her. His clothes were tattered, his skin pale and stretched over his bones. Jessica's breath caught in her throat as she realized he was still alive, or at least something close to it. His head turned slowly, the sound of cracking bones echoing through the room. When his eyes met hers, they were empty, void of any humanity. Jessica stumbled backward, her flashlight slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. In the darkness, she could hear the sound of movement, the scraping of feet against the cold concrete. She fumbled for the flashlight, her hands trembling as she tried to find the door. But it was too late. She felt a cold hand grasp her ankle, pulling her to the floor. She screamed, kicking frantically, but the grip was unyielding. The whispers grew louder, filling her mind with a cacophony of voices. She could feel herself being dragged across the floor, the cold seeping into her bones. Desperation took over as she clawed at the ground, trying to find something to hold on to, but there was nothing. In her panic, she reached out and grabbed a piece of broken glass. With all her strength, she slashed at the hand holding her, feeling it loosen just enough for her to break free. She scrambled to her feet, her vision blurry with tears, and bolted out of the room. The whispers followed her, growing louder, more insistent, as she raced down the hallway. She didn't stop until she burst through the metal doors and into the fading daylight. Gasping for breath, she stumbled out of the hospital, never daring to look back. The whispers were gone, replaced by the sound of her own pounding heart. But as she reached her car, she realized something was wrong. Her reflection in the window was not her own. The face staring back at her was gaunt, hollow-eyed, and twisted into a malevolent grin. She fled the hospital, but the face never left her. It haunted her every reflection, a constant reminder of the horrors she had unleashed. The black fog. Marcus was used to working late shifts at the power plant. The hours were long, the work tedious, but it paid the bills. The plant was located on the edge of town, surrounded by dense woods and a river that wound its way through the valley. On foggy nights, The place took on an eerie, almost otherworldly feel, with the thick mist swirling around the towering smokestacks. One night, as Marcus was making his rounds, he noticed something strange. The fog was unusually thick, clinging to the ground like a living thing. It moved in unnatural patterns, almost as if it was searching for something. He tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that crept up his spine, but it lingered, gnawing at the edges of his mind. As he walked through the maze of machinery, he heard a faint sound, like a distant whisper carried on the wind. He stopped, straining to listen, but the noise was gone. Shaking his head, he continued his inspection, checking the gauges and valves, making sure everything was running smoothly. But the fog seemed to be following him. Every time he turned a corner, it was there, thicker, darker, and somehow alive. The whispers returned, louder this time, though he couldn't make out the words. They were just out of reach, like a forgotten memory trying to resurface. Marcus's heart began to race as the fog closed in around him, the thick, inky blackness seeping into every crevice of the plant. He could barely see a few feet in front of him, the world reduced to shadows and silhouettes. Panic set in as he realized he was no longer alone. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and he could feel eyes on him, watching from within the fog. He broke into a run, his footsteps echoing through the empty halls. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to get away from whatever was out there. The fog was suffocating, wrapping around him like a shroud, filling his lungs with a cold, damp chill. Suddenly, he stumbled into a room he didn't recognize. The walls were covered in strange, pulsating growths, and the air was thick with a putrid stench. In the center of the room stood a figure, shrouded in darkness. It was tall, its limbs unnaturally long and thin, its face obscured by a hood. The whispers reached a fever pitch, the sound drilling into Marcus's mind, threatening to drive him mad. The figure turned to face him, and Marcus felt his blood run cold. Its eyes were hollow, empty voids that seemed to suck the light out of the room. He could feel its gaze boring into him, filling him with a terror unlike anything he had ever known. Marcus tried to back away, but his feet wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The figure began to move toward him, its steps slow and deliberate. With each step, the fog thickened, the darkness closing in until Marcus could barely see. As the figure reached out to him, Marcus finally found the strength to move. He turned and fled, the whispers screaming in his ears. He didn't stop until he burst out of the plant and into the cold night air. The fog was gone, the whispers silenced, but the fear remained. Marcus never returned to the power plant. He left town the next day, trying to leave the memories behind. But the fog followed him, haunting his dreams, and every time he closed his eyes, he could see those hollow eyes staring back at him. The crying child. It was supposed to be a routine delivery. Eric had been working as a courier for years, and late-night runs to isolated houses in the countryside were nothing new. But there was something off about this job. The address was unfamiliar, and when he looked it up, he found nothing. No listing, no history, just an empty plot of land on the map. Still, a job was a job, so he set out into the night, the package sitting on the passenger seat beside him. The road was dark, winding through dense woods, the headlights barely piercing the thick darkness. As he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. After what felt like hours, he finally arrived at the destination. The house was old, almost ancient, with weathered wood and windows that seemed to stare back at him like empty eyes. The porch creaked under his weight as he approached the door, the wind howling through the trees. He knocked, but there was no answer. Just as he was about to leave the package on the doorstep, he heard it, a faint, pitiful cry coming from inside the house. It sounded like a child, lost and scared. Against his better judgment, Eric pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was dark and cold, the air thick with dust. The crying grew louder, more desperate, pulling him deeper into the house. He called out, but there was no response, only the continuous wailing of the child. The sound led him to a door at the end of a long hallway, slightly ajar, with light spilling out from the crack. As he pushed the door open, the crying stopped abruptly. The room was empty, save for a small, old-fashioned crib in the corner. Eric's heart raced as he approached it, his breath catching in his throat. But when he looked inside, it was empty. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him, plunging the room into darkness. The temperature dropped, and Eric could see his breath misting in the cold air. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, slow and deliberate, coming closer with each passing second. Panic set in as he realized he was trapped. He pounded on the door, shouting for help, but the footsteps continued, growing louder, until they stopped right outside the door. The handle rattled, and then, slowly, it began to turn. Eric backed away, his eyes darting around the room for something, anything, he could use to defend himself. But there was nothing. The door creaked open, and a figure stood in the doorway, shrouded in darkness. It was small, childlike, but there was something horribly wrong about it. Its limbs were twisted, its head cocked at an unnatural angle, and its eyes were hollow, lifeless voids. The figure stepped into the room, its movements jerky and unnatural. Eric could feel the terror rising in his chest, choking him. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The child figure moved closer, its hollow eyes fixed on him, and then it opened its mouth. The crying returned, louder and more agonizing than before, filling the room with an unbearable sound. Eric clapped his hands over his ears, but it was no use. The sound was inside his head, drilling into his mind, driving him to the brink of madness. In a final act of desperation, Eric lunged for the door, pushing past the figure. He didn't look back as he fled the house, the cries echoing in his ears. He raced to his car, fumbling with the keys, his hands shaking uncontrollably. As he sped away, the house disappeared into the darkness, and the cries finally stopped. But the damage was done. Eric could still hear the crying, echoing in the back of his mind, a constant, torturous reminder of that night. He tried to forget, to move on, but the sound followed him wherever he went, driving him slowly, inexorably mad.